Good evening. Thank you so much for coming, for being here. My name is Caroline Green. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Ethics in AI, and I'm the lead of the Accelerator Fellowship Program at the Institute. The Accelerator Fellowship Program aims to build a global hub for AI ethics that unites diverse voices and disciplines to develop innovative solutions to the ethical challenges posed by AI. We have the pleasure of working with Accelerator Fellows who are global leaders and thinkers on these matters. And I'm delighted to introduce one of our Accelerator Fellows this evening, Professor Alondra Nelson. Professor Alondra Nelson is one of the world's leading voices on the social dimensions of science, technology, and governance. She is the Harold F. Linder Chair at the Institute for Advanced Study and previously served as acting director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she led the development of the landmark Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. As an inaugural Accelerator Fellow at Oxford, she is focusing on advancing a concept she calls thick alignment, a richer, more inclusive vision for how societies and technologies might flourish together. This evening, Professor Nelson will be leading a public panel discussion on the topic of AI and the state, governing technology, governing with technology. The panel will feature Cassandra Madison, Dr. James Phillips, Andrew Strait, and Elham Tabassi, who will join Professor Nelson to explore how governments can both regulate and responsibly use artificial intelligence in shaping the future of governance in public life. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Nelson, who will introduce the panel.
Hey, well, Caroline, good evening, everyone. And Caroline, thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. I am delighted to be here and to welcome you all. I want to say special greetings to Biban Kidron and to Nigel Shadbolt, in addition to members of the AI Policy and Governance Working Group who are here. So we're a group of multi-sector AI researchers, industry leaders, and policymakers that along with the Institute for Ethics in AI and the Accelerator Fellowship Program, in which I'm so grateful to be part of, are hosting this evening's panel. I want to thank the Institute for Ethics in AI team for their extraordinary hospitality and professionalism. Thank you, Petra, and thank you, Graham Bagley, for your incredible support. And thanks most of all to my Institute for Advanced Study colleague, Dr. Christine Custis, for all that she does to help make the AI Policy and Governance Working Group possible. Really our overflowing appreciation for all that you do to keep this work going. So this conversation this evening is part of a conversation that we're having over the next few days here at Oxford as a working group. As I mentioned, the working group includes people from different sort of sectors, disciplines, perspectives, and approaches. And we work together to find rough agreement and rough consensus around the multitude of concerns raised by the expanding use of AI tools and systems and their increasing power. We appreciate as a group that any benefits of AI will require that we attend to its risks, but also that we think wisely and collectively about how to steward these very powerful tools and systems for public benefit. Today, the working group held a convening here at Oxford at Jesus College, thanks to Nigel's hospitality, on AI and the state, and this evening's panel sort of broadens out those themes. And what are we interested in thinking about? This critical moment in which we're starting to adopt AI tools and systems, not only in broader society, but in governments as well. And governments stand as a kind of crossroad because they both must set the rules for the way that we use AI, and also determine how to responsibly implement AI and the work with these technologies within their own operations. These include things like automated social welfare decisions, public safety for social welfare and public safety, AI-assisted legislative drafting and public communication, and lots of things in between. And in the process, these tools and systems are reshaping relationships between citizens and states, and posing questions about public trust at a moment when trust in some places is low in democracy, trust is low in governments. How can the introduction of AI and algorithms be to the good of trust and of democracy and not to its detriment? So there are lots of consequential questions with significance for all of us, I think particularly for vulnerable and marginalized communities as well. Who will reap the benefits of these technologies, particularly as we use them in public services, and who will not? So part of our conversation this evening brings together an extraordinary group of thinkers and doers to take up some of these questions and more. They have a range of experiences across them that go from business to civil society to government to academia. And we're going to talk tonight about some of the questions, the crucial questions facing us about AI's impact on society, particularly with regard to the state. So I'm now going to introduce and bring up the speakers, and then we'll begin the discussion. And we'll leave about 15 or 20 minutes for questions and answers, and then there'll be a drinks reception afterwards that I hope you'll join us for. So first, Elham Tabassi is the director of the Brookings Institution Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative and a senior fellow at Brookings in its Global Economy and Development Program. She joined Brookings earlier this year following a distinguished career at the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the United States, where she most recently served as NIST Chief AI Advisor, leading its AI Innovation Lab, which aimed to cultivate trust in the design, development, and deployment of AI technologies. In 2018, she led the creation of NIST AI program into a globally respected leader in international debates on AI standards and policy. Among her many notable achievements at NIST, she was the lead author of its widely adopted AI risk management framework. She invented an algorithm for fingerprint image quality assessment that is now part of a global standard, and she served as the first U.S. federal AI standards coordinator. In 2023, Time named her to one of its inaugural list of the 100 most influential people in AI, Elham. Please come up. Dr. James Phillips is Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy at the University of College London. He was a lead author of the joint bipartisan report by Tony Blair and William Hague on a new national purpose for the UK, a major strategy document centering on the nation's future on science and technology leadership, as well as a report on national AI policy. As a special advisor to the Prime Minister and Secretary of State for Science and Technology, he worked at the highest levels of government decision-making on technology policy and implementation. In this role, he led the creation of the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency, ARIA, designed to fund high-risk, high-reward research, and initiated the UK's rapid lateral flow testing program during the COVID-19 pandemic. He holds a BA in neuroscience and computational neuroscience from Oxford, Exeter College, am I remembering? Yes, okay, I know that matters here. And a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Phillips, please. Cassandra Madison is the executive director of the Center for Civic Futures, a nonprofit in the United States equipping government leaders with the tools and expertise to safely explore emerging technologies. With 2 decades of experience, both inside government and alongside it, she has turned policy into practice by guiding the design and implementation of public systems that are effective and responsive to people's needs. As Deputy Commissioner for Vermont's Department of Health Access, she led the turnaround of the state's health insurance exchange and integrated eligibility system. She previously served as the Vice President of Partnerships at the Tech Talent Project, where she worked to modernize the federal, state, and local technical workforce. Cass. Andrew Strait is Head of Societal Resilience at the UK AI Security Institute, where he focuses on how AI systems impact social trust, institutional integrity, and democratic governance. With a decade of experience at the intersection of technology, law, and society, he brings expertise in both AI ethics and practical implementation. As an ethics and policy researcher at Google DeepMind, he managed internal AI ethics initiatives and oversaw the company's network of external academic and civil society partnerships, helping to shape responsible development practices for advanced AI systems. Previously, he was a legal operations specialist at Google, where he developed and implemented platform moderation policies addressing data protection, child safety, and other high-stakes issues where technology affects vulnerable populations. His work bridges technical AI development, policy implementation, and societal impact, experience directly relevant to understanding our conversation tonight about how governments can deploy AI responsibly while maintaining public trust. Andrew. Thank you all very much. Okay, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let me start with one question for all of you, and Elham, will start with you. kind of beginning and going to where I began with my remarks. So we've got governments that are supposed to protect us from AI harms while also using AI themselves, and to deliver services more efficiently, we're told. Is there a conflict or a tension here between this kind of dual role that government is supposed to be doing? Can governments effectively do both? And what does it mean for how governments should approach AI differently than private companies do, if you agree with that, given this kind of dual role as both the governor and use of AI in governance?
Thank you. Thank you so very much for including me in this group of very esteemed scholars. And thank you to Oxford for hosting us here. Is it a tension or conflict? I don't think there is a conflict, but there is a tension. And I think that the government should be able to do both, protecting public from AI harms, and also figure out how to use AI to improve the public services and the government operations. But the few points here is that government is not just a market actor. They have a much broader mandate. They have to serve everybody. They have to act under public law. They have to be accountable even when the systems fails. And when the private sectors are motivated and optimized for competitive advantage, government should optimize for and prioritize public trust, legitimacy, and equity. In terms of the expertise needed, I think regulating AI and deploying AI requires different skills. Regulating AI needs technical expertise to basically audit external systems. Deploying AI responsibly requires maybe procurement reform, operational evaluations, continuous monitoring. Another point is that the cost of failure for government versus public sector will be different. The cost of failure for public sector can be revenue or reputations, but when it comes to the government, if they wrongly deny benefits, it's the rights of people on the line, and then also eventually the public trust in automations and using the technology in the government. So wrap it up, I don't think the question and the choice should be innovation versus protections, and we should come up with the solutions and operationalizing frameworks governance frameworks that put the accountability in the heart of this, and think about how to do the measurements of many things across this AI systems, because we cannot effectively govern what we cannot measure.
Great, thank you for that good start. Let's come to you, James. I mean, from your experience working in Number 10 and doing science policy, how do you think about this? Is it tension? Is it an opportunity?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that one of the things which comes to mind when thinking about this question is, at least in the UK, which I'm obviously most familiar with, we have situations like this with the healthcare system. Previously, when we had nationalised trains, you have government providing something at the same time as it's to be regulating it. And likewise, things like the Bank of England, you separate out interest rates from the British Treasury, for instance. So in quite a number of situations, we have policy challenges where government kind of has a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And the solution is to kind of separate those responsibilities out quite clearly, and in many cases, air gap them. So, for example, your lobbying rules would be very different for one part of them versus another part, depending on which side of that regulation versus sort of promotion side it falls on. In terms of this and my experience in government, in sort of 2021, 2022, we were hearing from inside some of the frontier tech labs that they were seeing some very big jumps in capabilities. This was before it was public. This was sort of before the ChatGPT moment. You can actually see, by the way, in the prediction markets on when AGI would be here, there was these sudden drops throughout that period, but none of this was making it through to the actual official government systems. And relatedly, we were then left in this position where we were sort of saying, how do we deal with technology? But the people who were telling us about all these advances were the technology companies. So there's obviously like a major problem there. Like, who do you trust? So this was one of the real things that gave us an impetus to push Rishi and persuade him to do the AI Security Institute. And a core part of that was to bring people like Andrew in, so they weren't on the payroll of big tech, but could give a kind of separate view. And I think that's going to be really important going forward, that we have that kind of expertise separate from those companies.
So Cass, you work very closely with bipartisan state policymakers, elected officials in the U.S. How are you working with them, or how are they thinking about this kind of dual role?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think at the state and local level, there's less distance between the people who are thinking about regulation and needing to speak to their legislative counterparts about the right way to oversee these technologies, and the people who are deciding how it's going to be used internally. I think that what's really important is to bring together policy, operations, and tech. I think in government, often the conversations about each of those things happen in silos. And I think there's a world in which if government practitioners are experimenting with AI in safe and controlled ways, it can make them better buyers and can make them more sophisticated about the rules and regulations that should be applied. And government often lacks capacity. They're sort of in this reactive mode where they're just buying things. And if we can get out of that, and I think with the accessibility of AI and these models and enterprise systems can allow people to get a much better sense of what are they capable of, so that when they're getting a pitch or they're trying to decide on a rule or regulation, they better understand what they're capable of, which I think is an opportunity of this moment that is unique.
So all of us here have worked in government, past tense. You are currently working in government, Andrew. How do you think about this dual role, this tension, if at all?
It is a tension, it's a challenge. I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're talking about the use of AI in government, we're often talking about very different things. So it first off depends on what part of government we're talking about. The way in which certain parts of government, such as defense, are going to think about the procurement and use of technology will be very different from how departments like mine are thinking of it in the delivery of services, or how other departments are thinking of it in the delivery of law enforcement or other kinds of core services to the UK. I think that the challenge that we face in governments oftentimes is that we struggle to understand what is an appropriate AI use case, or what's a good problem that fits AI. And that's a perpetual challenge that every institution runs into, right? I used to work for 5 years at the A. Institute. A lot of our work was with local authorities trying to understand the procurement and use of technology. It's driven a lot by this desire to find efficiencies in a time of very low budgets and very sort of tough positions they're in, a time of polycrisis in many respects. And that is a really difficult position for governments to be in. Where I have seen success, and I'm very pleased to say I do see success inside this government, is when we have teams within government who understand that problem, who understand that there are certain challenges, certain issues where AI is very well suited to the problem at hand, where they can start to think about the types of values that need to be protected. So where explainability, for example, is essential, where having a sort of human face for government is perhaps more important, where how a decision is reached is more important than just reaching a decision. And where you have the ability to sort of test, evaluate, experiment, pilot with that, to understand the impacts on civil servants, on different people within government in a more holistic way. So I think that is some of the kind of ingredients, I'd say, to successful uses of AI in government. It's having the understanding of the limits and the opportunities technology raises in all of its different instantiations. It's having the ability to measure and understand those issues and monitor them over time. It's about having skills and capacity, as you've rightly mentioned. And it's crucially about having the ability to also monitor and maintain those technologies that you do procure. Because in government, we don't have the luxury of the private sector of getting it wrong and just finding another investor, right? When we get it wrong, it really matters. It really changes the way in which people trust and believe in what the institutions of government are offering. So we have to get this right. And again, I cannot stress enough, I genuinely see that in government every day. I came in perhaps with my civil society hat on thinking, oh, I'm going to sign terrible things. Genuinely, I feel like people internalize that in a very visceral way in this government. I will continue to talk about how wonderful my government is and other questions, but I'll perhaps pause there.
Well, I'm going to stick with you, so you have an opportunity to do that. So, one of the things we used to talk about with regard to Silicon Valley was like all the groovy titles that people could have, like chief Imagineer and these sorts of things. That was one of the perks of working in Silicon Valley. But I think you have one of the coolest titles actually working in government. Your mandate is societal resilience. It's both an extraordinary title, but also a daunting one. And so I want to sort of dwell a little bit on this risk question, exactly where you were ending. Like when a government system fails, it harms individuals. So that, alone potentially is detrimental. But it also has a kind of societal harm. I mean, this is exactly to your point that like people don't trust institutions themselves. And so you're talking about a kind of institutional risk as well. And so how should we think about institutional risk with regards to government use of AI? And does it change how governments should approach deployment compared to private companies? You were starting kind of to go here a little bit.
Yeah, having worked in the private sector where, again, the sort of, I felt viscerally as if somebody worked in trust and safety. So that the part of the teams in industry that are pointing out the problems and trying to protect users, oftentimes our concerns were pushed to the side in favor of product launch timelines. And that's just a really tough reality of the kind of current state of how project launches are done. It's kind of the opposite in government. We can't afford that, right? If we get something wrong, it immediately creates backlash, and it immediately creates problems, and it immediately creates a failure of government's ability to deliver for its citizens. And I think what that means is that you have to take a very high standard about choosing the kinds of AI-related problems that you're solving for. I'll give a great example that I'm very pleased to see. I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with the IDA AI team in government. This is a team that's building public sector facing tools for local and national government. And their whole theory of change is we're going to find products or problems that the private sector won't solve for, where there is no market value in doing it, where the productivity benefits are great, and where it meets some basic heuristics. So, truth doesn't really matter. The stakes of getting wrong are fairly low. There's lots of verification. It's kind of a relatively low risk but high productivity use case. And you can see that in some of the examples that have come out. The extract tool, this is a tool they created using Google Gemini and various other kinds of advanced models. It's solving a very boring problem of planning commission, but I promise you, this is the kind of exciting use case from a public sector side that has huge productivity benefit. It's not going to be automating civil servants. It's going to be these relatively boring and mundane admin tasks that nonetheless save enormous amounts of money, time, and resources. And that's backed up, I think, in general by other kinds of initiatives this government's put in place. We have a data ethics framework that governs how we think about data use. We have a generative AI checklist and protocol that governs how we use various kinds of LLM products inside government. These, I think, are initiatives that the UK has been quite forward-thinking on. I think it's a good start and a foundation, but it's really driven by this view that we cannot afford to get things wrong. We have to get them right. And I think the places where I've seen in my previous roles where government has failed at that has been a sort of lack of that sense of urgency and that sort of feeling of not knowing what you're actually buying, not really being able to understand if this technology is giving you what you need or if it's something that might be a bit overpromised.
So I want to ask you a point of clarification because you said cases in which the truth doesn't matter. So are you talking about building on foundation models or large language models and the hallucination? The use case doesn't matter in the same way.
Yeah, it could be creative use cases,
Okay,
right?
right.
So it's I think it's heuristics where kind of like the sort of risks are fairly low. So where truth doesn't matter, where it can be easily verified, where sort of the status quo is no worse than if the tool gets something wrong. These are kind of sort of the basic kind of guiding principles that I think are kind of driving many of the use cases where we see actually quite successful public sector deployments. And I got to stress that's a huge number of high benefit use cases. They're just not the ones that I think. If you watch a lot of science fiction or read about science fiction like I do, perhaps we're going to see. It's not going to be automating CEOs. It's not going to be automating the president of the United States or having robot butlers. It's going to be seemingly mundane but significantly impactful back administrative tasks. I think it's maybe we'll get better someday, but I see that as the real opportunity here. And I got to say, I do have quite a lot of hope and excitement now being in government that we are on the way to seizing those opportunities.
Thank you for that. Okay, so Cass, I wanted to come to you. You lead the Center for Civic Futures, and that organization focuses on how technology shapes democratic life. With AI systems increasingly mediating people's interactions with governments, from chatbots answering questions to algorithms determining who gets housing assistance, for example, how is the citizen-government relationship changing, if at all? And are we kind of sleepwalking, kind of robots into a future where people interact with algorithms instead of having kind of a social interaction with democracy? How do you think about that?
That's a great question. Yeah, and I want to +1 to the boring use cases.
Yeah.
Because I think government is so strapped for capacity. I think about, you already got to this, but this idea that people build trust, trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets.
Yep.
And all these little micro interactions that people have with government day to day really impact their feeling of government as a whole. And so you think about people who, in the US go to Department of Motor Vehicles to renew their license. It's like a dreaded day. And
it's an entire day.
It's an entire day. And if you are able to do something online quickly, people don't shout it from the rooftops. You don't get a medal for being an amazing public servant. People are pleasantly surprised, and we need lots and lots of interactions like that. And I think I contrast that with my experience in government, where I had this front row seat to this gigantic health insurance rollout disaster. And to put a human face on this, like one story that sticks with me is, there was a mom who's, I can't really tell the story without tearing up, but there was a mom whose child had passed away, and we were sending her a health insurance bill every month. And we literally could not take that child's name off that bill for a year. She had to get it in the mail every single month. And it's those kind of interactions that I think are so detrimental, not only for that mom who had to relive that trauma, but her entire experience with government is going to be shaped by that, not by the quick, pleasant experience that she had at the DMV, perhaps. So I think that's part of the challenge that we face, is that once someone has a negative interaction, it really carries through. I think to the sleepwalking question, I think that we're already sleepwalking. This sort of gets back to the trust in institutions problem. People don't have a lot of trust. They're already disengaging with democracy. And so I think the question and challenge for all of us is, can we see this moment as an opportunity? And if we can, actually, when it comes to AI, a lot of what we're talking about is just good tech implementation principles. Make sure you know what problem you're trying to solve. Make sure you know what success looks like. Make sure you're talking to your users. Make sure you're deploying incrementally. These are ways that government should have been interacting and building technology and applying principles for many years. Now with AI, there's this renewed focus on tech. And so if we can apply those principles here, I think it can be an opportunity to build trust.
Thank you for that, Cass. So James, I'm going to ask you the question I hate most about when people ask me about working in Washington, which is bring me behind the scenes. What was it like? And I think for you, can you give us a sense of behind the scenes of how decisions get made in science and technology policy from your experience? When a government minister is deciding whether or not to deploy, say, an AI system for processing visa applications or prioritizing, hospital wait lists in the NHS, what are the cluster of factors that actually drive that choice? Some of it is AI, but it's not all AI, yeah?
Well, I advised two different PMs. One was Boris, and the other was Tony Blair, obviously after he'd left office, and they're very, very different people. So that's the first thing, right? That it's a much more human thing than you would imagine. I think if there was a show or something that would explain most of what it's like inside bureaucracy, to me, would be Yes, Minister. And there's one that always stands out where the minister is taken to the hospital and says, Minister, you're going to be so happy with the hospital. It's incredibly clean. There's no waiting lists. We haven't had any incidents or accidents for a year. And then the minister goes, oh, and do the patients like it here? And he goes, oh, no, we don't have any patients yet. So this is sort of the way in which the system gives you information, but actually it can be very, very misleading. So if I was to say one thing, it's the thing is much more like, is the minister in a good mood today? What have they read in The Economist in the morning? Someone from Number 10 once had to send a message to the Secretary of State who was making a decision about whether to give, I'll keep it vague, but to give several hundred million to one company or the other. And they'd essentially read an article in The Economist and made the decision partly on that. And Number 10 had to say, look, we can't just run this government like we're reading the Beano in the morning and kind of making a decision based on that. So that's a huge challenge for advisors. I think in terms of crisis and the COVID response, I came in during April 2020, so the PM had just come out of hospital. And I remembered throughout almost every day a quote from Sir Christopher Mayer, who was the ambassador to the United States during the Iraq War. And he said he was in the Foreign Office. He was actually given this talk in Oxford, but he was talking about being in the Foreign Office, and he said there's an extraordinary depth of learning and brilliance in the Foreign Office, entire libraries dedicated to any given issue. Whatever crisis comes, whatever difficult decision you need to make, there will be a series of treaties on these. It's wonderful. But when the crisis hits or when the decision comes, no one reads the books and no one ever looks at the library. And this is an unfortunate reality about how government too often works, is people will read one page and not much further beyond that. So that's on the ministerial side. On the official side, it's almost the complete opposite. There's a book recently called The Unaccountability Machine. And essentially what it said is, no one's actually accountable inside a decision-making bureaucracy in government because no one person can change the decision. So in that system, no one can be held to account, because if you couldn't change the decision, you can't be held to account for it. So you have these kind of two systems inside there, one where no one's in charge and one where one person's in charge. And how do you get around that for something like AI, where you require difficult judgment calls made by experts who are not necessarily able to explain it to ministers? Well, the solution that was come to in the last government and carried on to this one was to bring in someone like Matt Clifford and essentially delegate authority from the Prime Minister to them. This was also used during the Vaccines Task Force, where the same technique was used. And I think that's a way of getting around this general problem that the people who make the decisions don't have the expertise to do it, and the systems that do, by definition, no one's actually in charge. So I think bringing people external to government in, empowering them, and then holding them to account, I think that's the way of solving that problem that's worked so far.
Good to know about Yes Minister. Thank you for that, James.
It's fantastic.
So Elham, before your time at Brookings, you worked at NIST, which is like one of the few federal entities in the United States that's established in the Constitution. I mean, it's an old organization that does standards and measures, and you worked on developing standards and frameworks that many governments worldwide use as reference points. But standards are sort of one thing, right? And actual procurement and deployment is another thing altogether. So I think, what do you think about, do you see a gap there? What surprised you most about the gap between having good AI principles or a good, risk management framework on paper, and what government could do to actually be able to oversee, deploy, develop AI systems responsibly?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is a persistent gap between AI principles and operationalizing those. And how government manage AI systems. And I think building on what James said, I think a lot of the problems are kind of the culture and institution rather than just the technology. But let's just unpack it a little bit. I think most of the public agencies and institutions either have built their own or adopted the right vocabulary and language to talk about responsible use and deployment of the AI systems, transparency, accuracy, fairness, and all of those things. But what is really lacking is to actually operationalizing all of those things. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that, you mentioned the procurement. The current procurement are for static goods and services, and AI systems are adaptive to the use, to the data. So that's one thing. And then agencies has to define the requirements and specifications up front, and it is notoriously difficult to kind of understand the risks and impacts of the AI systems up front and try to predict them. They rely on input from the vendors to set up the specifications, and that leads us to, or government used to, narrow metrics that sounds objective like accuracy, but they lack the context of the use and data representations. I saw this firsthand in the testing for face recognition that we were doing, that in the laboratory testing, we will see very high accuracy numbers, but when they were deployed at airports, at border crossing, that accuracy numbers sort of vanished, and we didn't see that. Then the other thing is that this concepts of continual monitoring of the systems, again, because they are adaptive. After the signing of the procurement and kind of the contract and all this, the line of accountability sort of vanishes and diffuses. That technical knowledge and technical control stays with the vendors. Government and civil servant don't have the right expertise, but frankly, the budget and incentives to actually be able to do that. Operational teams move on, and then who is actually responsible for the continual monitoring becomes a question. And again, without the capability and capacity, we cannot address that. Another institutional problem. And then there is, I think Andrew mentioned the use of the pilots and sandboxes. They are great, but they are also mostly formed around inputs and metrics from the vendors. And then scaling them up needs certain expertise and experiences and a dedicated team. So kind of moving from just getting a pilot and scale it up to more sort of a tiered deployment become really important. So just put them all of these things together is that I don't think the problem is yet coming up with another set of frameworks and principles. There's many of them there. We need the technical capability, capacity, incentives, and the budget to actually operationalizing all of them.
And if I could stick with you, Elham, do you think AI tools, systems, models make this gap issue more acute? I mean, you've worked on lots of different technologies in your time at NIST. So you worked on fingerprinting and cyber and all of these things. Does this moment and this gap feel more acute to you than some of the other emerging technologies that you've worked on in your career?
Right, I think so, because at least the speed and scale of the technology development and the way they get deployed. ChatGPT in a few months gets hundreds of millions of the users. But also the fact that the majority of, and I did a lot of evaluations for the biometric systems, we could actually get the systems, bring it into the laboratory and test them, and that was static. Well, they had the dependence on the condition of the use and the lighting, but that gets exacerbated by the AI systems. So all of those evaluations that we were doing for other technology becomes sort of limited and not quite applicable, and they had to be augmented with stress testings and red teaming to kind of look at the edge cases, but also field testing when you get them into the real context of the use to do that. So, and all of them are, again, new capabilities that the government needs to build.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about innovation, which is a word that hasn't come up. And usually when you talk about AI, it's the first word that comes up. But I think when you talk about AI in the States, not the first word that comes up. But, I think that there's like, I'm a big proponent of what I call policy innovation, that there's lots of ways in which innovation in the state is really important, both with AI and I think around AI. So, Andrew, your job is at the UK AI Security Institute, and it's also the case that, as I've been watching from across the pond, the UK government is both trying to be a leader in the AI space and also an innovator in the AI space. And so how do you think about the relationship between safety, security, and innovation in the work that you do?
Yeah, I struggle with the word innovation because oftentimes I don't quite know what we mean by that term, right? Because that can mean really toxic forms of innovation that we don't want, which is undesirable. It can also mean really wonderful forms of innovation, which are kind of sort of running towards the right path. So I suppose where I think of it is, if you do start with the assumption or the belief that technology can be a force for good in the world, or that it can, if adopted appropriately, and for the right kinds of tasks, it can achieve great things and sort of help uplift society and help human flourishing, then we have to understand what the right constraints and what the right sort of safeguards are on that technology, right? We don't have the ability to drive really fast in cars, not that I do. I don't have any speeding tickets, I swear. But we wouldn't have that ability without seatbelts, without all the different safety mechanisms that give us some sense of trust this technology that we're driving is not going to explode or kill us or cause any kind of harm. And I think we're kind of at that moment right now with AI, and I think we'll be for some time with this very fast-paced moving technology domain. We're trying to understand what those safeguards look like. We're trying to work out what the appropriate way to constrain or to test this type of technology is. And that, I think, is something that is what fuels innovation. You talk to any business out there about who's not adopting AI right now or who's struggling to, they say the same things. They don't know if it works. They don't know what they should use it for. They don't know how to test it. They don't know if it's secure, if it's robust. And those are very real challenges that I think tie back to, if we solve and address issues around safety and security, we do help build consumer confidence and public confidence as technology should be used and is appropriate to use in different contexts. So a lot of what our organization does is trying to work on parts of that problem. Our focus is really trying to understand how advanced AI capabilities are changing and driving certain kinds of risks and how we can mitigate those risks. And I think there's something to say about what we're worried about with advanced AI systems. We're worried about a technology that has really challenged and created the ability to synthetically generate any kind of modality, whether that's text, image, video, audio, you name it, to a point where we cannot identify if it's real or not. We're talking about technology that's generally capable of a variety of tasks. No longer do we have sort of narrow specific tools that can be constrained or tested and understood in this way. We now have sort of multi-purpose applications and tools that are much harder, if not impossible at the moment, for us to measure in a meaningful way. Much of our research is challenging and trying to address this measurement issue. And we're talking about technology that increasingly is being used to delegate more and more kinds of advanced cognitive tasks and responsible decision-making to an AI system, often without as much human oversight as we might have. Now, that is the great challenge we have to figure out. We need to understand in what context is that safe? How do we test it to ensure it is safe? How do we ensure it's secure? How do we ensure that it is actually being done in ways that are helping humans flourish? And we do that in many respects. One is through testing. We do lots of evaluations of advanced capabilities, trying to understand, are they creating uplift and criminal misuse? Are they enabling new kinds of non-consensual imagery abuse or fraud? We do a lot of tests of conducting research into the ways in which capabilities could be harming humans. We just completed the largest study of 79,000 participants, trying to understand what drivers of the technology might create more persuasive effects, the ability to convince people of certain political views better than a human expert can. We've done lots of work building tools. We have the Inspect tool, which is our kind of flagship evaluations tool for building ways to assess evaluations, really trying to address one of the core challenges we just talked about from Elham, which is that we don't have risk and context-specific evaluations to understand risk in particular contexts. If I'm deploying a system in the energy grid, we still struggle to understand how to test for that in the same way that we might test an AI system deployed for another use case, kind of for banking or accounting. And we do a lot of funding. A lot of our organization's remit and focus is really about building a wider field of AI resilience and security. We're not trying just to do this all ourselves. We've put about 140 million in grants out to different academic and civil society organizations in the last year around issues around alignment, security, child abuse imagery, non-consensual imagery abuse, fraud, agentic deployments in finance. The list goes on. And these are security challenges and safety challenges that won't be resolved by the market alone. They do need a government body to step in and drive research and mitigations in this space. The last thing I'll mention, and I promise to stop talking, is we do quite a lot of work on mitigations. At the moment, this includes things like trying to come up with our own theory of what psychological safety practices that are expert informed by mental health practitioners should look like for the labs. It includes things like trying to test KYC, know your customer checks at banks, by the sort of on the existing capabilities of advanced AI systems to try to make society more robust to these changes. That's the kind of work that I think will help build resilience, the ability to both absorb and prepare for these kinds of challenges and shocks that AI will bring. And the more we have that, I think the better off we'll be. But we have a long, long way to go.
Yeah. So one of the through lines, Andrew, in what you were saying, and I want to come to you, back to you, Elham, because this is it was about measurement and how we think about measurement, and this is your expertise, and you did measurement work at NIST, and you are standing up some new measurement work at Brookings that I think we're all really excited to watch as that evolves. From your experience, I mean, how do you think about the difference between measuring AI systems for sort of, say, regulatory compliance versus measuring a government's own AI system, and making sure a government's own system is working as intended? Are governments bad at both, better at one than the other, good at both? What would you say about measurement?
I think those are two different types of measurement. The compliance that you said is a sort of measurement as a gatekeeping. There is a set of specification and standards and some threshold set, and usually some specified methods for testing, and it just look at the conformity assessment versus the testing for the application of the AI within government. Then it is, as you mentioned, operational evaluations to make sure that the technology is doing the intended use, it's fits for purpose, it's achieving its policy objectives while maintaining validity, reliability, transparency, fairness, all of those trustworthiness characteristics that we need. In terms of that government ability to doing any of them, As Andrew mentioned, it's a huge challenge to do any of this testing, and we don't have the standards or specifications to do the conformity assessment for. So I would say that both of them are difficult and technical challenge, both for the public and private sector. But there is also a difference there that for the compliance testing, usually those are, you get other people from external to look at them. So you get the public scrutiny, you have contributions from the public and from the community to build those specifications. But the testing and operations within governments often goes unnoticed, and there isn't a lot of the publications about them. So if something is deployed in not the right way or a perfect way, it may go unnoticed for a long time. So figuring out how to, I admire the UKAC for publishing a lot of these things and talking about these things. So we need to do more of those testings within the governments and have them to talk about that.
Thank you for that. So, James, let's talk about modernization. And, one of the pressures that I think all governments are feeling is a pressure to be innovative, to be modern, to be efficient. And you've really seen this up close, both, trying to bring and deploy the tools in government, but the political pressure as a political appointee of making campaign promises or other kinds of public expectations around the state and modernization, and the kind of tension, I think, between really wanting to be responsive to, wanting to be a seamless modern government and also wanting to get things right, measurement in other ways, wanting to protect people's rights. How do you think governments should be navigating between this political pressure to show that they're doing AI? What's your AI strategy? Every organization is facing that, and trying to get it right and really trying to ensure that, people's rights, access opportunities are being protected.
So in terms of the politics, I don't think I ever once gave a piece of political advice to ministers. I tried to avoid that as much as I could, partly because the whole science and tech area, it doesn't, if you have focus groups or polling, it's not high on the list. And I think that does give, if I was counselling ministers on this, I'd say, look, focus on doing the right thing, because whilst AI is important in many, it's more important than perhaps it seems in the public eye in terms of their voter preferences. It's not going to change whether someone gets re-elected. So I think this gives someone a bit more latitude than they might think. One of the big dangers, I think, especially today, is the extent to which politicians' attention spans are controlled by the news cycle, the 24-hour news cycle. It's really kind of astonishing. You think these people are optimizing for winning elections or running the country. They really far too often are just optimizing for, will I be on Radio 4 tomorrow? What's my soundbite? And sometimes if you've got a minister who's quite annoying, you can just arrange media stuff for them and then get on with the real stuff.
But you would never do.
I would never do such.
You would never do.
I would never do such a thing. But it has been known as a technique that special advisors use from time to time. In terms of, I think Dom said the plan was to send Boris around the country doing press events whilst he ran the country, which I don't approve of. But I think that was his explanation. He said that to the BBC. In terms of how you actually get things done at the same time as have this getting it done right and protecting rights. I think I want to slightly sort of challenge the dichotomy that's implied here. One of the challenges during COVID, and I think it's repeating with AI, is government hasn't changed the culture to think experimenting is good. I remember when we were trying to get rapid testing going in early 2020, and we said, well, we need to do some experiments, we need to do some pilots. And the system came back and said, you can't do experiments on the public, James. That's not a good comms line. But that's kind of the history of how these things work, is you do things at a small scale and you scale them up. And I think one of the big challenges that our political class have is to try and shift that culture back towards people realizing that that's actually a sensible thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It's not something that they should be ashamed of. And I think if we'd had more of that attitude during COVID, it would have gone better. And I hope we can bring it back for AI. We're going to have experiments whether we like it or not. It's whether we're in control of them.
Right. So kind of thoughtfulness and intentionality.
Yeah.
So Cass, this is where I want to come to you. What does it mean to make thoughtful decisions about how and where to deploy AI? Does it mean that does it mean that we need leaders who understand the technology? Does it mean we need leaders who know how to involve ranges of impacted and effective communities? Does it mean both? How should we be equipping, people in this room who are policymakers or leaders, want to be policymakers or leaders in this space for thinking about what it means to get deployment right and do it thoughtfully and with intention?
Yeah, I mean, the idealized version is that you'd have a leader who would fully understand the trade-offs, like what good could happen, what bad could happen. They would anchor the public interest, and they would be able to make a decision based on all the perfect set of information, which
Right.
obviously does not exist, especially not with AI. So then you get back to a set of like values and principles to guide those decisions and help leaders understand how can you be thoughtful when you don't have a perfect set of information. I think that, again, some of it is a foundation of good tech practices and decision making. So some of the things we already talked about around, like, again, understanding what problem you're trying to solve, making sure that the people who are going to be impacted have a voice in the room, making sure you understand what good looks like. And then there's a whole bunch of things that are new that we've already touched on in the AI space that I think just make the stakes higher. And so this is how are you overseeing systems that are continually changing? I think for traditionally in government, these leaders are focused on the moment of making a decision of are we going to buy this thing or not? Are we going to deploy this thing or not? And AI requires a lot more attention and focus after things are deployed. And as everyone here has mentioned with great thoughtfulness, that that's still a pretty nascent field. And so there's a lot of more work that needs to be done there. I think the other thing is that right now it's kind of a crapshoot how much tech and AI expertise a person has that is in charge of making that decision. So sometimes it is a technologist, and that technologist may or may not know anything about AI.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not a technologist. We work a lot with health and human services secretaries who still a lot of times think about technology as something that the technologists do, but at the end of the day, they're still making decisions about how, when, and where to deploy these systems. And so for me, the dream is that one of those leaders could walk into a room with somebody who's pitching them something and they would feel confident. And that looks like knowing what questions to ask, knowing who to have in the room with them, knowing what BS smells like, knowing what good looks like. And so I think for experts here, being able to educate and provide frameworks to those leaders so that they can walk into rooms with confidence is the anchor for making thoughtful decisions.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to go to questions soon, but I want to just do a lightning round with you and ask you to, I think, dream and sort of think about the future. So, in the next, if you could ensure that governments get one thing right about AI use and deployment in the next 5 years, what would that one thing be?
Oh, I start.
Sure, whatever, yeah,
Sure.
yeah, sure.
This again shows my biases on the measurement and that
Measure all the
to
things.
that you cannot govern what you cannot measure. But I think what government can do is figure out how to build a ecosystems for evaluations of the AI systems to test, monitor, understand AI systems, and hopefully in a kind of independent testing, but also figure out what we can do right now. What is the feasible starting point right now to kind of bootstrap and iterate on that to get there, and also understanding that the solution to that is not just a technical solutions; it's a lot institutional and culture and how to actually go build this.
Thank you. James?
I think if government over the next 5 years can find a way of addressing some of the bio-related issues that are coming from AI, this was something 3 or 4 years ago we were getting quite worried about, and was one of the reasons for doing AC. Companies are being a lot more open now about the dangers posed with bioengineering and these things. And I think if we can't get on top of that issue, then we're not going to have success with more complicated ones. So it's kind of a litmus test. If they can get that right, we may learn something to carry forward. But if we don't, we've got problems.
Thanks. Cass?
I think it would be focusing on the non-sexy back office applications of AI. And if we could figure out how to leverage AI to eliminate processing backlogs, that would be transformative from a staff and a constituent experience perspective in government.
I think on government uses of AI, it's about breaking out of the logic of efficiency, because we're not trying just to be efficient. We're trying to deliver really high quality care.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real challenge in what types of metrics of success and how we grade ourselves success that just is a challenging situation, but one we have to always hold ourselves to account to. And then in terms of risks of AI, how sort of government continues to look at this, I think it's really just about continuing to be maintaining independent research and analysis and testing of the claims that technology providers are making. I think the more that we hold developers to account, and I think we are doing that in many ways, the more we can ensure that these technologies that are affecting all of us in very, very intense ways across various parts of our lives remain safe, secure, and that there's some kind of independent challenge to claims of absolute utopia that we might get occasionally.
Yes, let's go there. Okay, so this has been an extraordinary and rich conversation, but let's open up the conversation to others in the room here. Graham has the microphone, and there's some hands here.
Thank you very much for that incredibly insightful conversation. My name is Lisa. I'm a PhD candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute. And when we talk about AI in the state, a key pillar of this discussion, excuse me, is AI sovereignty. And countries like the UK have established a sovereign AI unit while relying heavily on a handful of US-based companies like Palantir, OpenAI, and NVIDIA. Wow, my voice is really going. I'm so sorry. Which maintain a real monopoly over the market. So what does the concept of AI sovereignty mean in a case like the UK? And do you think it can meaningfully be implemented, or is the outsourcing of capabilities inevitable? Thank you.
James or Andrew, do you feel?
Do you want to go first?
Oh boy, it's a great question. I think a lot of what we think about when we think about AI capabilities and sovereignty in this country is this idea that there is an opportunity to be had with AI development that we want to seize as much as we can. And one of the challenges that I think comes up with this is understanding what's the actual demand for in the UK for a thriving domestic UK ecosystem that data center development and these deals will meet. And I think that's kind of the constant challenge. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so we've made a big bet on this as kind of a real kind of route towards unlocking future opportunities for the UK's growth. Now, I'm not going to sit here and promise you that's going to happen. It's not my team, not my monkeys, not my circus. But it is a genuinely held belief. And I think the challenge then is also one of which, where can the UK be competitive when we talk about the AI stack? I think the reality is that we are not going to be competitive on chips. We're not going to be competitive at the frontier model level for many reasons, down to just pure lack of resources relative to other countries. So where is the opportunity for us to be really innovative? I think that's in the application layer. And that's where you're seeing so much of the plans around our regulatory sandboxes, some of these other initiatives we put in place around assurance funds and assurance ecosystem funds, around some of our innovative UK innovation grants, all aimed at trying to take the sort of base of this technology that others are providing and trying to apply it to other places. Now, have we gotten it right all the time? I'm not going to sit here and defend every decision that we've made, but I genuinely think that's the impetus and the motivation behind much of the policy that you see when it comes to data center investments. It's really trying to build the foundation for that kind of innovation at the adoption there.
I don't know what I can add, to be honest, on this one. I mean, we thought about this quite a lot 2 years ago, and then with the new national purpose reports with Blair and Haig. And since then, I think the open source thing has just kind of scrambled my thinking on this. And I don't know quite what it means for, what does AI sovereignty mean when you have open source models which are like 95% as good as the private models? So it's kind of gone down in my thinking since then. But yeah, I mean, the situation 2.5 years ago where it was looking like we'd be all dependent on American models, I don't think was such a good possible situation. I think you have to have some sovereignty over it. Hopefully open source is getting us there. I think, by the way, it's the single biggest argument for open source, is this.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, do you see there being enough technical expertise within governments to deal with technology today and in the future? And given how much these frontier AI labs are willing to pay for the top researchers, we've seen a lot of headlines with Meta paying just ridiculous sums of money for researchers. How are governments able to adequately compete for that kind of talent? Thank you.
Why don't you take that, Cass?
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a long time.
I have. So before I started Center for Civic Futures, I worked at an organization called the Tech Talent Project. And my main goal was just try to recruit strong technical leaders into government. And when I first started doing that work, I was like, there is no way that people are going to leave private sector salaries for government service. And when I talk to government, that is what they think the major barrier is. And what I found is that there were a ton of people out there who were sitting in their high paying jobs being like, this feels soulless. And I want to give back, and maybe not for their whole career, but for some part of their career. And they just had no idea, where do I even start? How do I get a job in public service? How could I leverage my skills? And so I think a lot of times in government, I say we, am not in government anymore, but I still have that ethos, but count themselves out. And so don't actively recruit. So I think that's one thing, is making it easier for people to find paths into government. At least in the US, the hiring processes into government are notoriously difficult. Nobody understands them. It's very unlikely that you would even get through a basic application process without essentially concierge service. For 5 years, that's what I did, was for strong technical leaders, was provide concierge service to get them through a government hiring process, essentially. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is, like, once someone lands in government, how do you make it an environment that they will stick out for more than a couple years? And that gets back to creating some of these safe spaces for experimentation and innovation, that if they're in government and just constantly hitting walls over and over and over again, that's going to exhaust people. And so you'll have them for a few years and they're going to leave and they're going to tell all their friends how hard government was, and then they're not going to want to go in either. So I think there's some cultural things that have to change, but I think it's less about the paycheck than people think, at least for a certain subset of people, and you just have to go find them.
Yeah, speaking as one of those people who, like, going into government was the first time I had taken a pay bump in my entire life, because I went
A
from,
pay bump down.
no, up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I had gone from tech industry to civil society world for about 5 years,
Oh, I
and
see, I
then
see.
came to government. And I got to stress a few things. One is, I think the thing I'm surprised by relative to 5-6 years ago when I was working in policy at DeepMind is every department in government has a very solid understanding of the issues, risks that AI technologies are bringing in their different domains. I think actually that is a huge change I've seen in the UK government, and it makes me, I'm so impressed by the quality of people, not just in the Security Institute, but across other parts of government. I think the challenge is in trying to keep that sense of the risks and the understanding of those issues updated with the fast, incredible pace of this technology that we're moving in. And that requires having deep networks into, outside of government. It means talking to people. It means being a bit open and transparent about what you're seeing, and trying to kind of form communities and build coalitions. And I think the most successful teams in government I've seen that are able to sort of manipulate or navigate this really challenging domain are ones who have those connections, have that kind of very open and transparent way of working. Perhaps the ones I've seen have suffered a bit more are the ones that have tried to keep things sort of too tight-knit and close. But I really don't see that concern as I once did about civil servants and teams not being across the issue.
And if I can double click on that, I worked for government for about 26 years, being with Brookings since March, and I can say that in government we are really motivated with the sense of mission, and that is a very fulfilling thing, that you're actually doing something. And there are a lot of people, and I hired a lot of people and building the team, and there is a group of people out there that are really motivated with the mission and not the paycheck.
We are hiring.
So we've got one here, Graham, this gentleman. Is it Charles? Yeah.
Very nice discussion from the panel. Charles Sommerin, I'm an independent advisor to some of these organizations you talk about. The panel hasn't elucidated on the challenge of the strategic objectives to delivery. One of the key things we found out in government, and I'll give you Manchester Combined Authority, had this big project, second largest GDP, growing city, HS2 cut off, and they had this B network. And suddenly we had this money given to them of X billions, enhance Manchester, and the civil government, central government has given them these objectives. You need to deliver X, Y, Z. How does government work together with AI sitting in it to enable services delivered to the citizens?
You want to take that?
I can just talk slightly more general to just AI, but we were thinking about this problem over the last couple of years, and thinking about how the military does some of these things. And in the military, you have sort of DARPA type agency, and then you have like the special forces. And the special forces are kind of like the test demo bed, and then if it works there, they kind of scale it out. So there's currently, the Tony Blair Institute just published a report on this, basically taking the DARPA model and having a program director whose essential job is to kind of pair advances in AI or engineering biology to a public service use and kind of program manage that transition in the same way you do in the defense space. And I think that helps you get around this challenge that as a technology is maturing so quickly, it can sometimes be quite difficult for very large procurement bureaucracies that may be composed of generalists to deal with. But if you bring in sort of technical experts to run these programs, you may make a different result. So Tony Blair Institute put that paper out a few months ago. Yeah, I'll be advocating for that at the next election. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I would say like my experience over the last 10 years has made me a government capacity nerd. And I think in this age of rapidly evolving technology, the structures that underlie government's ability to buy technology, to oversee technology projects really have to change in order to have any hope of we're never going to keep up with how fast technology is going, but try to close the gap a little bit. And so it's budget reform, it's procurement reform, it's project oversight reform. They're big, thorny things that also no politician or elected official gets excited about tackling, but are like absolutely critical to being able to experiment safely and rapidly iterate. And so I just think about in everything we're doing, how can we be constantly running two plays? Where if you're experimenting or running a pilot, how can you use that moment as an opportunity to try to move the needle on some of these other structures so that at least you're kind of setting things up, greasing the skids for longer term work and not just being focused on the short term.
Other questions? You want to do this side of the room, Graham, since we've taken 3 over here? No.
Hi, thank you for the panel. My name is Joe Forward from the University of Oxford's Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre. I just have a general question in terms of a lot of what we hear about AI. It's hard to cut through the hype and the narrative that it's going to be transformative and we have to win the race. And then yet tonight we've heard some kind of the use applications in government, not sexy, mundane things targeted at low risk areas that won't make money or for the technology. So my question is just how much of that narrative that we're being fed do you buy into, and to what extent is AI a solution looking for a problem?
I'm happy to start. It's a great question. And I think if you ask different folks in the UK AI Security Institute, you get very different answers, which I think reflect perhaps sort of how much you think the pace of the capability of the technology is going to continue to advance. And I would say probably for me, how much you think capability, full stop, is the thing that's going to be changing.
Yes. Yep.
Now, my view is capability is like one part of a many-sided coin. It's, many of the sort of things that we I think take for granted is the assumption that if you have a capability of technology to do something, that it will be reliable enough to do it enough, and that society will just mass adopt it for that purpose. And I think that's just not the case. A lot of what my team does is we monitor the use of agentic systems in different sectors. We do a lot of monitoring of the use of advanced AI capabilities in different C&I, critical national infrastructure sectors. And we find, unsurprisingly, very low adoption rates relative to these claims that the technology is going to like overnight change our economy or overnight automate all cognitive tasks that can be verified. And I think it's because there's so many kind of other forms of obstacles and barriers that people and adopters want to see it resolve before they feel confident to use it. And I think it really comes down to the fact that, frankly, people don't want to just mass disrupt society all at once. I think what we want is things that work and feel safe and are robust and reliable. And so, my personal view, everyone else stresses my personal view, is that one of the biggest challenges government always will face, and this is not new, this has been the case since I joined Google in 2010, it will continue to be so, I think, for our future, is we're in a sector, technology, that is built on hype and is built on a lot of FOMO, a lot of fear of missing out, and a lot of belief that this technology is far more capable than it always is. And you will always see that kind of hype cycle curve of inflated expectations being dashed from the cruel rocks of reality as we realize this is not the thing we thought it was. But I want to stress, there will always be those use cases that we find that actually this is a really wonderful, great thing. That's the challenge, I think, that government faces itself in when it talks about the use of the technology. And if you look at some of the rhetoric from governments in the last 10 years, it's gone from we'll automate the civil service to we'll find some of these boring administrative tasks that technology is really suited for. And I think that's a win. I think that's a great success story because it means that we're able to kind of experiment safely and securely. Yes, we'll have some major challenges, but we will probably come out the other end with a really good product that does fit the need. Yeah, I hope I'm right about this. I could be totally wrong, and we're just like as we were saying this, Sam Altman's released AGI into the world. But I get the sense that more likely than not we'll be in that kind of continuous position.
I think it's an excellent question, and I would just add to this. We talked a little bit, orthogonally about markets, but the hype is really about markets, right? And I think if you, in the context of the United States, for example, I mean, some economists have said that we would be in a recession if not for a few tech companies and a few kind of infrastructure AI stack companies like NVIDIA, et cetera. And so, the speculation and the hype drives incredible valuation. And I think, and there's talk about whether or not there's going to be a bubble. There was news in the FT yesterday about an American investor, short selling both, NVIDIA and Palantir. And so, there's a lot of like hype, speculation, shenanigans happening in the market. But I think to Andrew's point, as we see with a lot of technology, so I come to AI from working on genetics, on human genetics, and the hype around, personalized medicine and what all that was going to mean. And then, you see the hype cycle, and then you see a kind of plateau where you get to mundane adoption. And, I think in some instances we are entering that with AI, but we've got this kind of swirl of hype all around as well. And so, and I think that there are people with vested interests and economic and profit interests and sort of driving a hype conversation around these technologies. So are they powerful? Yes. Might they be transformative? Possibly. But the hype is sort of well above that for quite interested reasons.
Just add one small thing, just to add, which is that doesn't mean that we should not prepare for the places where transformative effects on society could occur and where things could go really bad. I can't stress enough. I think it's likely that we'll be in that position, but it does not hurt at all for government to be forward thinking and to prepare for the worst.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the insightful discussion. I'm Felipa. I'm also a PhD here at the Environmental Change Institute. And my research has been looking into AI's impact on climate and AI climate governance. And in the climate space, AI deployment, to the extent that I understand it, a lot of them requires reliance on big tech companies and infrastructure systems. So things like Google Earth data for environmental monitoring or satellite imagery stored in AWS systems and et cetera, which has great opportunities and potentials, but then also carries the risk of over-reliance, not just for immediate cybersecurity threats, but also more increasingly thinking about systemic lock-ins and path dependencies in terms of the climate governance. Is that a risk? Is that, maybe I'm overthinking it, and I was wondering what you're thinking about that risk. Are there things that are already being done to prevent that, mitigate that? And also coming back to Alondra's initial question, is that also a risk to the government's ability to regulate the big tech companies on which the infrastructure and systems are foundational to all of these like tech solutions in government? Thank you very much.
You want to take that?
I didn't fully follow the question, I'm afraid.
I can start. I would say I think it is absolutely a concern in other domains. The path dependencies points, if I understood it, I think it was sort of using the example of climate science data, but I would say that is something we're actually monitoring. One of the biggest risks that financial firms we speak with, banks in particular, is the systemic risk of how almost every financial institution is dependent on 3 providers. And if those providers go offline, and we just witnessed a few weeks ago, any one of them, you have significant outages that cascade and can sort of stem throughout all parts of society. And that is a real problem and a real challenge when we talk about resilience of society to those kinds of outages. I think it also extends into other domains around, who will be the arbiters and the controllers of scientific knowledge in different domains going forward, right? As more and more artificial intelligence is being used for scientific advancement, that does create concerns and challenges around how to navigate a world in which more of our knowledge and understanding of the world is dependent on technology providers who, in certain scenarios, might not be providing or enabling access to that information and data in a more widespread way. So those are very much concerns, and I think we do see those as well in procurement. One of the many things that we are interested in public sector procurement practices in general is that concern of vendor lock-in. The idea that you buy technology, it might be for a very low amount, slowly over time, rents are extracted that increase that amount. It's a real issue and something that I think we've seen throughout the last 20 years of technology policy and procurement practice, not just here in the UK, but in other sectors and domains. And it is one that we are actively thinking about inside of government. We're baking that in very much into our own thinking about this, though it is, again, incredibly challenging to deal with.
And if I can add to that, at least at the foundation model level, open source can be a player there, and important to think about this. But as we are seeing, the bottom layer of the stack, the chip, the hyperscaler, the foundation model developer are more becoming very few players, and then
consolidation. Let's take one last question, Graham. Maybe let's do this side of the room again. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. So something that keeps me up at night is the concept of regulatory capture. And I say this as someone who's worked in the industry, and then I worked as a regulator here as Financial Conduct Authority. Is there any effort or interest even in trying to measure that or identify that? All of these powerful entities, if they're lobbying just to be a good citizen or to kind of keep innovation and competition at bay, because just the cost of regulation and complying to these complex set of requirements would be so much that only those handful of names that we've discussed could actually afford to be in the marketplace.
You want to take that? I mean, obviously, certainly it's a problem. And I think, I know the US context most, but I know that has implications for the UK and elsewhere. The sums of money that are spent by technology companies on lobbying are sort of profound and are really sort of giving shape to what the ecosystem looks like. I think how we think about in the academic literature regulatory capture from spaces like fossil fuels or energy assume that you actually had regulation. I think we are even struggling in the space of AI to have regulation to be captured. I mean, the entire kind of market and ecosystem is captured without regulation necessarily, or with just some small bits of regulation. One of the things I noticed in the last couple of weeks, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy put out a request for information about how we should deregulate AI and the United States government. Please understand that AI is not regulated in the United States, right? So to put forth a call to industry, civil society, and academia for bold ideas about deregulation for a space that's not, regulated is astounding. And then I've been kind of following some of the responses, and there's a big lobby, professional association organization, Net Choice. I think it was Net Choice, and their response was, we really recommend that this administration rescind, when you hear what I'm saying, rescind the voluntary commitments. It's like, no one has to rescind the voluntary commitments of the Biden administration. You can just not do them, and you're clearly not doing them. So, I've been very interested in how we talk about regulation and deregulation in a space that's, on the one hand, formally, in the US, not regulated at all, really, and to this extent that you had FTC, SEC regulating, they're being told they don't have to, or they can sort of claw things back. On the other hand, however, it is the case that there's a lot of, in the United States context, a lot of administrative intervention in AI policy across the whole stack, right? So even if you don't have strong antitrust legislation, you do have a government that is insisting on company, investing in companies, that's making immigration policy that bears on whether or not you can hire workers, that's making trade policy centered on, critical minerals and rare earths. And so it's an interesting kind of moment where you don't have regulatory capture in the same way that we might have thought about in environmental settings. But there's a lot of state intervention in the AI ecosystem happening right now, I think, in US.
I also, just to add, I think at the state, because there's not regulation happening federally, a lot of is being pushed down to the state
Yes,
and local
yep,
level.
yep.
And that's been really interesting to watch. I think one thing is that's where there is a huge talent and expertise deficit. I mean, a lot of states have citizen legislatures who are essentially volunteers.
Right.
And they don't have staff. They certainly don't have people.
They work half the
neutral-
year, they make
Right.
$20,000 a year or
Yes.
something, right? Yes.
Yeah, and they don't have people to rely on to give them good neutral information at all. And so there are some organizations and efforts that are trying to solve that, but trying to solve that across all 50 states is very difficult, especially in some of the small rural places. There are some states who, not surprisingly, places like California or Colorado, who are like trying to take leadership roles in setting regulatory precedent and saying, hey, here's how we think these things should be regulated. And I guess there's this hope that other states will come along, but I think we're sort of watching that play out in real time. But it's very distributed right now, and it's highly variable what sort of expertise or support individual state or local communities have in actually understanding and having neutral sources of information and expertise.
So Elham, James, Cass, Andrew, thank you so much for this really important conversation. I hope you all join me in thanking them for being on this panel this evening.